Good morning. One of the interesting things within our culture is this sort of cultural myth that we have around the idea of kind of the Lone Ranger. You know what I mean? Like the idea that the lone great leader who can walk out and accomplish amazing things all on their own, changing and transforming the world out of the interior strength that they have as an individual human being. And within our culture, this idea is so deeply ingrained that for so many of us, we often believe the same thing. We believe that this is who we are supposed to be. That we're supposed to be men and women who are strong and powerful and independent and accomplish mighty and tremendous things on our own. And sometimes this leaves us feeling a bit inadequate and a bit afraid. Because we recognize our own weakness, we recognize our own culpability, we recognize that we're not maybe accomplishing all the change that we'd hoped that we might have been able to produce on our own. One of the interesting things is that as we read the Bible, we often see biblical characters through the same lens. Because we imagine the idea that it's great lone individuals who accomplish mighty things. When we look at the biblical characters, this is also what we see. We see Daniel on his own, facing down the lions and standing strong and courageous in his faith. We see Moses moving out ahead of the people, out into the wilderness, leading and guiding as a strong and courageous lone leader. And we see Paul out there on missionary journeys all by himself, bringing the gospel to people everywhere, transforming and changing the world. But the challenging thing about this perspective is that it's not entirely accurate. When we think about Daniel, we may see him facing down the lions, but we forget all about his three friends who journeyed with him and encouraged him and strengthened him and stayed faithful and true with him along the way. When we think about Moses, we forget about the fact that he had his brother and his sister really close at hand the whole way through his leadership, and that Moses raised up an entire new generation of leaders and encouraged them and equipped them and shared his anointing with them so they could flourish and thrive and be all that God intended them to be as a nation. And the Apostle Paul is maybe the most interesting case of this situation. After Paul's conversion, we almost never read about Paul on his own. It's always Paul and Barnabas, or Paul and Silas, or Paul and Timothy. We see in the early parts of Paul's ministry, he was mentored and encouraged and strengthened by those who were more mature in their faith. We see that Paul was blessed and sent out on mission by the elders in the church in Antioch. We see him journeying around always with other people. And as he grew and developed in his ministry, his maturity in Jesus, we see him pouring back into the lives of other younger people like Timothy and Titus. And as he journeys through, there's always this group of people around Paul, wherever he is, whatever he's doing, whatever preaching he's about. Almost always, Paul is together with a group of other people. And we see this also playing out in the way that he writes his books. There's a sense of encouragement and strength and challenge, and he keeps listing a whole bunch of other people around him. You see, Paul recognized that he wasn't on his own. He recognized he couldn't do the ministry and the work on his own. And he's really intentional to make sure that he honors and recognizes the significant and important contribution that those around him are making. And sometimes when we think about the Apostle Paul, we imagine him as a bit of a hard person to get along with, someone who's maybe a bit cranky and a bit tense. But when we read the New Testament, we see that there's people who are just deeply devoted to him. And even while he's in prison, he's almost never on his own. In prison, he usually has a fellow prisoner with him who's another Christian, or a group of people around him who choose to stay with him at risk to themselves to serve him and to continue to serve the ministry so that nothing will hinder the movement of the gospel going forward. It's a really amazing and dynamic piece of relationship. You think about while Paul is writing Colossians, he's in prison, and a whole bunch of people just choose to stay with him. And they recognize that if Paul is condemned by the emperor, they may also be labeled as enemies of the state and hunted down, and everyone will know exactly who they are because they were with Paul all of the time. They sometimes must have had to endure people pushing them back and fighting against them and maybe roughing them up a little bit as they came to visit Paul with guards who maybe weren't very kind or very caring towards them. But no matter what, they want to stay with him because this dynamic sense of community around Paul. And in the book of Colossians itself, we see this played out right from the very beginning all the way through to the end. For example, the very first verse of Colossians says, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother. Paul and Timothy are writing this letter together. And if you look closely at the vocabulary that's used in Colossians, it's slightly different than many of the other epistles that Paul wrote. And this has led some scholars to assume that Paul didn't actually write this letter, but it's someone else copying him. But the much more reasonable assumption is that Paul and Timothy are actually writing this letter together. And the reason why there's a variance and difference in some pieces of vocabulary and ways of expressing idea or the fact that Timothy is actually functionally involved in the content that's being created. They're literally doing this together, even though we imagine this is only a letter written in isolation by the Apostle Paul. And then when we fast forward the whole way through the book, we come to the end. And Paul takes a really significant amount of space to describe a whole group of people who are traveling with him and to speak directly to particular people that he's writing to. And think about this just for a minute. Colossians is like 4 chapters long. And he takes more than half of one of those chapters just to describe the people around him, to honor those who are serving alongside of him, to bless and encourage those that he's writing directly to. Because Paul is living in this dynamic space of community, this deep sense of connection. This is where we want to pick up where we left off last week in Colossians chapter 4, beginning in verse 7. And so if you have a Bible with you, Bible app, feel free to pull that up. Also, there's a QR code on the screen beside me. If you click on that, it'll take you directly to the passage and some questions for personal or small group study. Some people have also been using this to take notes during the sermon, so I won't take it personally if you're on your phone while I'm preaching. I won't think that you're just checking out Facebook. It's going to be fine. And one of the things as we look at this kind of a passage together today, when we read these sections of the scripture, what we most do is we usually kind of skip this thing over. You know, if I'm reading it through the book of Colossians, I'm not just thinking, oh, I can't wait to get to the end and the long list of names. You know, that just doesn't happen for many of us. But I want to encourage you to do today, don't skip this over and don't tune out. I want us just to consider as we read through this passage together today, what's the kind of community that the Apostle Paul is living in? What kind of relational dynamics does he have going on around him? And how does this also challenge our perspective? To live in a healthy place of community with those around us that God has placed in our lives for this particular season. So let's dive into this passage together. And I've been told that if I read through these names quickly and confidently, you'll have no idea if I've said them correctly or not, and we're going to be fine. So it's going to be a great time together. So Colossians chapter 4, beginning in verse 7. Tychicus will tell you all the news about me. He is a dear brother, a faithful minister, and fellow servant in the Lord. I am sending him to you for the express purpose that you may know about our circumstances, and that he may encourage your hearts. He is coming with Onesimus, our faithful and dear brother, who is one of you. They will tell you everything that is happening here. My fellow prisoner, Aristarchus, sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. You have received instructions about him. If he comes to you, welcome him. Jesus, who is called Justus, also sends greetings. These are the only Jews among my co-workers for the kingdom of God, and they have proved a comfort to me. Epaphras, who is one of you, and a servant of Christ Jesus, sends greetings. He is always wrestling in prayer for you, that you may stand firm in all the will of God, mature and fully assured. I vouch for him that he is working hard for you, and for those at Laodicea and Hierapolis. Our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas send greetings. Give my greetings to the brothers and sisters in Laodicea and to Nympha and the church that meets in her house. After this letter has been read to you, so that you also read it in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you in turn read the letter from Laodicea. Tell Archippus, see to it that you complete the ministry that you've received in the Lord. I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hand. Remember my chains. Grace be with you. So let's just take a minute to look at some of the dynamic relationships that the Apostle Paul has around him in this passage. He starts off with Tychicus. Now, Tychicus is the person that Paul would have entrusted the letter to the Colossians to. After this letter was written, and Paul writes the last sentence in his own hand so that it can be authenticated as actually belonging to him, it would have been handed to Tychicus. He would have taken it, gone on a series of places, probably walked a whole lot of different roads, probably got on a boat somewhere to take this letter to the city of Colossae. And when he got there, he would have been the one who would have got up on a Sunday morning, he would have read the letter to them, he would have explained to them all that's going on in the Apostle Paul's life, and if they had any questions about a particular phrase or passage or what does this really mean, Tychicus would have been the one who would have explained it to them and helped them understand it more fully and more faithfully. So Paul must have trusted him incredibly to represent him and his intentions and the scriptures and the word of God in a really unique way as the one who took this letter directly to the people in Colossae. And as we read the scriptures, this wasn't the only time that Paul trusted him in this way. In Acts 20, we read about Tychicus as being a faithful fellow traveler with Paul who's serving alongside of him. In the books of Ephesians and 2 Timothy and Titus, Paul also describes Tychicus in a similar kind of way in each of those letters. And so you can imagine it must have been a really interesting ministry for Tychicus to come to the Apostle Paul, spend a bit of time with him, receive a letter, take it to some part of the ancient world, go and care for that congregation, encourage them, read the letter, come back to the Apostle Paul, get the next letter, and take it out to the next church. He has a really unique kind of ministry and a really important place that Paul gives to him. And then Paul moves on from Tychicus to the next person, who is Onesimus. Now, Onesimus is in an amazing season of life. He's a runaway slave who fled from his master, Philemon, at some point in time. He found the Apostle Paul likely in Rome and was converted, and he had given his life to Jesus. And in this exact moment, he's at a terrifying point in life because Paul has sent him back to his master who he ran away with, Philemon, carrying this letter and the letter to Philemon, and he doesn't have any idea what's about to happen to him. He's been devoting his life to Jesus and serving him alongside the Apostle Paul, and Paul longs to have him come back and continue to serve as a free person, but they have no idea what's about to happen. And through his life and the letter to Philemon, Paul writes out a particular explanation that ends up unraveling the practice of slavery throughout the Christian world. It's a powerful, dynamic movement of God that's about to take place through Onesimus' life. And then he goes on to Aristarchus. He's described as a fellow prisoner. And what's interesting about Aristarchus is probably what he would have done is he would have chosen to serve as the Apostle Paul's servant. So he would have given up all of his personal liberty and all of his personal freedom to just stay with Paul all of the time in prison, to make sure that he was cared for, that he was looked after, that he had everything that he needed. Could you imagine the intensity of that, of choosing to give up all the fullness of your life and everything that you would like to do, so you can just stay with someone and encourage them and help them out and take care of the daily needs that they have so that they're able to journey through a really hard season in their life. And interestingly, when we read about this guy, Aristarchus, one of the things that happened to him also in the city of Philippi, when Paul was there earlier, many years before, a huge riot broke out in the city. The people were so angry at the Christians, and they grabbed a few of them, including Aristarchus, and dragged them into the theater. And thousands and 10,000s of people yelled and screamed at them and threatened their lives for hours on end. And he was one of the guys that had endured all of that. But he wasn't in any way dampened or hindered or pushed back from continuing to serve God. He pressed in all of the way to give up his freedom to serve Paul well in his imprisonment in Rome. And then we move on to Mark. Mark is described as the cousin of Barnabas. And earlier in his journey and his walk with Paul, he'd started out on a missionary journey and he just couldn't do it. He gave up and he went back, and Paul simply wrote him off as being someone who wasn't really of a whole lot of value to him. But we see that some significant movement has happened in Mark's life to change his heart, and also in Paul's life to bring about a sense of reconciliation and confidence again in Mark. And Mark, likely at this particular moment in time, Mark is likely the Apostle Peter's secretary, the author of the Gospel of Mark, and he's likely visiting Paul in Rome to connect with him on some particular matter that's going on between the churches in the various places that they are. We have Jesus called Justus, who's another Jewish co-worker. And I like that Paul describes him as someone who is an incredible comfort and encouragement to him. Paul's not so confident in his own strength or his own capacity that he doesn't say that he doesn't need those around him. Again, he acknowledges the fact that he needs people to comfort him, to encourage him, to help him through this particular season. And he's not afraid to admit that particular emotional level of need, and to recognize the unique role that Jesus called Justus and others around him are playing in Paul's life. Then we have Epaphras, who is someone from the city of Colossae who joined up with Paul and his crew somewhere along the way. And Paul's writing back to say he's doing an incredible job for you and the church in Laodicea, which is about 10 miles to the north, I think, and Hierapolis, which is just over, I believe, to the east. He's saying he's serving all of you so well as churches. And I just love the description of him. He's constantly wrestling in prayer for all of you. No matter where he is, he's wrestling and longing and praying and interceding that God would move and work and hold the Colossians close and empower them to be faithful all the way through. And there's such a delight in the mutuality of this passage. If you remember from last week, the Apostle Paul is saying to the church in Corinth, I want you to pray for me. Pray that God will open a door so that I can share the gospel. Pray that I will declare it clearly in the way that I should. And even as he's asking the Colossians to pray for him, he's saying, we within our group are also constantly wrestling in prayer for you. There's a sense of mutual care and mutual support between these different groups and different people. Then he talks about Luke, a dear friend and doctor. This is Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, who continues to journey with Paul all of the way through. And then describes a guy named Demas. And the interesting thing about him, he says almost nothing about him here. But if we continue to read on in the writings of Paul, sometime in the future, when Paul writes the book of 2 Timothy, he describes Demas as someone who, for the love of the world, abandoned me. And it's interesting that even here within Paul's close inner circle, there are moments of betrayal. There's moments of hurt, there's moments of abandonment, there's moments of difficulty. But it doesn't negate the need for Christian community. Because even if we know there's moments where we might possibly get hurt, we want to continue to pursue God and to live in healthy, meaningful relationship with the people around us. And Paul models this really, really well. And then he writes to the church there, encouraging them with this healthy mutual sense. Once you have read this letter, make sure you share it with the church in Laodicea and read the letter that has previously been sent to them. Encourage each other with the things that you know. You have things to give to one another. He mentions particularly a woman named Nympha who hosts the church in Laodicea within her home. And can you imagine how comforting this would have been? Do you remember throughout the last couple of months, we've talked about the Colossians as a group of people who are constantly under threat. People are pushing them all of the time, saying, you should give up Jesus for this or all these different things. And Paul is saying, don't ever do it. You know those moments in life where you're just under stress, where you're just really feeling a lot of pressure? It can mean so much to know that there's somebody else in your corner, that you're not totally on your own. And Paul is reminding them, saying, even though you feel like you're under pressure, remember the church in Laodicea. It's 10 miles up the road. Go and see them, share what you know about me with them, and receive from them also the things that they know about who I am. Get to know God better through this experience together. He's reminding them they're not on their own. And then he encourages a guy named Archippus, saying, make sure that you fulfill everything that God has entrusted to you. The ministry you have is so valuable. Don't ever give it up. And I wonder what was going on in that guy's life. How many times have you had an experience like that? Where maybe you were just feeling discouraged or overwhelmed or really wanting to give up, and someone just said to you, don't ever give up. Make sure you do faithfully everything that God has called you to do. And as we read this passage, we recognize Paul is living in a meaningful, mutual place of Christian community. He's not a lone ranger. He's not the lone leader, great and powerful, out on his own. He's living every single day with people around him that he needs and who need him. He's not living in a place of isolation. And he writes to this church to remind them, you also are not isolated. You are not alone. There are other churches around you that you also need and need to be encouraged by. When I read this passage and others like it in the letters of Paul, I feel like this is the living embodiment of what Paul writes about in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14. In 1 Corinthians 12 through 14, Paul says that every Christian should be like, we are a body. The church is a body living together. We need every single member that serves in different ways. We are meant to support and to encourage and to uphold one another, to build each other up, to become whole, all of us together following Jesus' direction. Within that, there's this healthy sense of interconnectedness, that we have been created to live and to serve and to follow Jesus within the context of community, and we desperately need one another. And when I read passages like this, it reminds me, Paul didn't just say this. He literally lived it out. And even in a season of life that would be so isolating, living life in prison, he still has all kinds of people around him that he honors and blesses and affirms, and maybe even recognizes in a unique way the value of the role that they play. As they take these letters to different places, they continue to support and encourage him as they're writing gospels and other things so that the church will have these things for millennia to come. Paul is reminding us that we need one another. And he's practically living out this in all of his relationships, even in a place of prison. Because none of us has ever been created to be an autonomous individual. As followers of Jesus, we have been created to live in a real and a meaningful place of community. And I'm really aware of this in my own life. I'm aware today that I didn't get here and that I don't stand here on my own. And I think about all the people who've contributed to my life to get me to this particular point in time. I think about my parents, and I think about my siblings, and all of the ways that they spoke the truth and the life of Jesus into my life. I think about growing up in a really small but powerfully growing church plant where seemingly every single month someone would find Jesus and their life would be changed, and the way that that shaped my perspective of the power of Jesus and the gospel to bring life and transformation and healing. I think about my youth pastor, Joel, who was maybe the first person in a way that deeply connected with me, that affirmed to me that I have been gifted and called to serve the church. And he called these things out in me in a really powerful way that has held me and led me steadily to this point in time. I think about all of the coworkers and all of the boards and all of the friends that I've had in so many different churches that have built into me and encouraged me along the way. I think about Maria and our girls and how they continue to speak the life and the truth and the presence of Jesus into me day by day. I think about Maria's family, and from the first time when we started dating, they just started to pour into me and to build me up to become more of the person that God created me to be. And up to today, they continue to be very faithful to pour into me. And I recognize in this moment that I'm not here on my own. We have a really amazing and powerful staff team that do a tremendous job in so many different and diverse ways that they serve. And I recognize that I couldn't do the things that I do without all of their strength and support and encouragement and creativity, their wisdom and their guidance, the unique gifts that they bring, their dedication to their work day in and day out, week in and week out. And today I'm really particularly mindful of Pastor Rod. This is his last Sunday as a part of our staff team, and I'm just so grateful for Rod. You know, our first conversation together, he looked at me and said, "I am here to make you successful, and I will do whatever it takes to make you successful." And he's just really done that. He's been selfless, he's been gracious, he's been humble, he's been kind and generous in the way that he served me and served you as a church. I'm so profoundly grateful for his service and so constantly praying for him and Adeline as they step into the season of retirement, that God would continue to bless them, because they've been a tremendous blessing to me and to so many of us over the course of the last number of years. But I also think about preaching, because I think sometimes this moment can contribute to the myth that we have as a culture. I can look like a lone person up here doing something powerful and dynamic, and hopefully powerful and dynamic and life-changing. But again, I recognize I'm not here on my own. Like, I had 3 really good preaching professors over the years that just really built into me. I've had numerous people over the years who've coached and guided and helped me work out some of the problems and continue to guide me through things where I'm struggling to preach accurately and really well. I think about so many different people that have spoken into me, great authors that I get to read and understand more about how do I communicate the truth of Jesus in meaningful ways. And I recognize also that every single week on a Tuesday afternoon, whoever is up here preaching, the Teach team gets together and walk through the message together to make it the most clear and the most compelling message that it possibly can be. I'm not here on my own in this moment. This is a team effort and a team experience to bring the truth of Jesus to us in the most clear way that we possibly can. And again, I also recognize that I'm here because there's a tremendous support of the board behind me. You have an amazing board who are passionate about Jesus and passionate about you, who are intentional to make sure that I'm leading and that we are walking as a church in a way that is faithful to God and His best intentions for us. They're tremendous people. I'm so grateful for them. And I also recognize today that I get to stand here, and I'm so grateful for you and all of your support and your encouragement and your strength and your grace and your ongoing patience with me as we continue to walk through these journeys together. I recognize that you are willing to work with me and to go with me to the places that Jesus is calling us to go. And that means more to me than I will ever be able to express or ever be able to say. I was trying to think of a way to describe the way that I see our relationship, and I think the best example was kind of a living example from a couple of months ago. As I talked to you about, I was training for a half marathon over the course of the summer, and I was about to run the race with my friend in a couple of weeks. I wanted to do one long last run to see if I could, can I actually do this thing? So one evening I got out and I started running. It was going really pretty well. I just felt great. It was moving along. But then I hit, kilometer 18. So I've been running probably for about an hour and 50 minutes at this particular point in time, and I'm just hitting the wall. I've got 3 more kilometers to go, and I'm just like, okay, can I get through this thing? As I'm running around the area within my neighborhood, what God did was He just brought me so many of you. And so many of you just happened to be there on the sidewalks as I was running by, and all of you said almost exactly the same thing. You're doing great, Pastor. Just keep going. And it was this beautiful moment. It was this powerful expression of you are with me and for me. You're blessing and encouraging me. You're strengthening me to do the thing that I felt like I didn't have the capacity to do. And I feel like this is what our relationship looks like. This is how it feels to me week in and week out. As I lead and preach and walk through the parts of my role, I recognize that you are with me and for me. And your affirmation and your encouragement and your support means so much to me. I couldn't preach or lead with the kind of freedom that I do if I didn't have your support and your encouragement, if I didn't recognize that you're with me on this journey. So thank you for being the church that you are. It's a tremendous gift to me. And again, God has designed each and every one of us to live in life-giving relationship. I recognize that I am here fully dependent on the Spirit of God, but also by His design. I live dependent on those around me because I can't do this on my own. And so how about you? Who are the people that God has placed in your life in this particular season? You see, I wonder if maybe the most important thing that we couldn't do this morning is what if we just gave up our cultural myth? What if we gave up the concept that we are supposed to be able to be strong, powerful, independent people who can do this entirely on our own? And what if we chose to embrace a more biblical perspective of life, that we have been created to live life within meaningful and mutual community, where by God's design we need one another to flourish and thrive and to be all that He has intended us to be? I recognize that for so many of us, we hold ourselves back from community. We're afraid to share our struggles or prayer requests or our joys or our challenging moments of life because we don't feel like we're supposed to do that. We've been socialized or somewhere along the way told that we're supposed to be able to do this powerfully all on our own, and so we hold ourselves back. And again, maybe in pride or maybe in fear or maybe out of misunderstanding, we just keep trying to do the things that God is calling us to do in our own individual strength and capacity. But this passage reminds us that we desperately need one another. We have been created to need one another. And so who is it that God has placed in your life along the way? You didn't get to this particular moment in time on your own. And so just think for a moment, who have been the critical people that God has placed in your journey to lead you to this place? Maybe it was friends or pastors or mentors or family members or someone else that God just used to speak His truth to you in a really unique way. Who led you to this point? And then as you think about this particular moment that we're in, who does God have for you in this season? Who are the people that He's using in your life right now? Who are the people that continue to speak hope and joy and peace and confidence and life and truth and challenge and affirmation into you in this season? Do they know how meaningful their impact is on you? What I want to encourage us to do is just a couple of things. Again, in this passage, the Apostle Paul is really careful to honor each unique person for the role that they play in his life. And so what I want to encourage you to do over the course of the next week, I want you to think about the people who've led you to this point or the people who are playing a significant role in your life right now, those people that just came to mind. I want you to send a text message or to write a note or an email or a Marco Polo video or a TikTok video or a carrier pigeon, whatever way seems the most meaningful way to connect with them. I want to encourage you, just send to them a note of thanks saying, this is the part that you have played in my life. This is the way that God has used you to make an impact on me. Thank you. Again, you have no idea what kind of an impact it may have on them. So often we imagine that the people that have played a significant part in our lives know how deep their impact has been, and most of the time they don't because we've never said it. And so in this week, I want to encourage you, just share a bit of what God has done in your life through those around you. And the other thing I want to encourage us to do is to be open and available to see who else might God want us to embrace and to create a sense of meaningful community with. We recognize as a church we're going through a really significant season of change. We've grown by about 500 people over the course of the last 12 months. It's been a significant movement that God is doing in our life as a congregation. We recognize that there are many people that are still trying to find their place within the context of this community. So I want to encourage you just to approach maybe Sunday morning or your approach to church with a bit of an open hand to say, is there someone else, God, that you want me to embrace? Is there someone else that you want to use me in to help them to find a meaningful sense of community? Is there somebody here this morning that feels lost or alone or isolated and you want me to connect with them? And let's just hold ourselves in an open posture to see who might it be that God might invite us to connect with or to create some sense of meaningful community with as we move forward as well. And I also want to recognize whenever we talk about relationships, there can be some pain and some challenge involved. Because for some of us sitting here this morning, we are in a season where we just feel a bit isolated. We feel a bit lonely. We feel maybe significantly unseen. And maybe this comes to us because some of our loved ones we've lost them, they've passed through from this life into the fullness of the presence of God. For others of us, we've moved into this community and it's challenging maybe to find a new community. And for some of us, there have been painful, broken relationships that have left us feeling a bit wounded and hurt and self-protective, and we're not sure how close we want to get to other people around us. Whatever your reasons might be, there's a few things I want to encourage you with this morning. Again, I want to encourage you that God cares much more about your level of relationship than you do. He has created you for meaningful community, and so spend some time asking Him, Jesus, who do you have for me? Where's the place of meaningful community that you want me to embrace and to engage with? And then just be open to see how He responds. Again, He cares more about this than you do. And then also I want to encourage you to be willing to take the risk and to step out and to be a really good friend to somebody else. Sometimes we're waiting for someone to come to us, and all the time someone else needs us to move towards them. Again, I recognize often in this process there's some false starts and it takes some perseverance. I remember when Marie and I moved to a new community once, we were trying to find a sense of friendship within a church, and we're kind of connecting with one couple. We were becoming friends with them. We invited them over for lunch on a Sunday morning after the service, and they never really talked to us ever again after that moment. And so we're like, ooh, okay. So again, sometimes there's false starts. You just realize, okay, that's obviously not the people. Let's move on to somebody else. Kind of go on from there. And again, sometimes it just takes a risk of vulnerability. Again, for most of us, we really crave and we long for meaningful relationships, but very few of us are willing to do the work that it takes to actually get there. And so sometimes it means just choosing to step out, to maybe be a bit more vulnerable, not in a massive overshare, but being willing to invite someone, to ask someone, to share something of ourselves as we engage in relationship with them, kind of gauging appropriately the level of intimacy in the relationship, and are you ready to take the next step to get to know someone more on a more meaningful level? Another helpful way to connect with people sometimes is to serve together. And so maybe joining one of our teams in the church that serves in a particular ministry or in an area of the community, and just serving alongside other people is a great way to get to know people better, because you always have something to talk about. And you recognize that you're a part of the team. You feel like you're in a really different way when you're serving. Maybe it's about joining a life group or a support group through our pastoral care department. Maybe it's about something else. But again, I want to encourage you to be willing to persevere through, because relationships take time to build, particularly meaningful relationships. But this is what God has designed us for. And so right now what I'd like us to do is to just take a minute and let's just consider and contemplate, who is it that God has placed in your life so far? Who are the people that God has used to bring you to this particular point in time from the past? And again, as God brings people to mind, just thank Him for them. And maybe take a minute to write down a few of their names so you can express your sense of thanks and affirmation to them for the role that they've played in the week ahead. Let's just take a minute and ask God, who have been some of the people that have played that critical part in our lives to bring us to this point in time? And then just take a moment to consider, who is it that's in your life right now? Who has God placed in your life for this particular season? And do they know how much they mean to you? And then just spend a moment asking God for what you need. What do you need in your relationships during this season? Do you need closer friendships? Do you need the courage to reach out or to share more of yourself? Do you need someone who will help you grow deeper in your walk and relationship with Jesus? Do you need healing from places where you've just felt really deeply wounded? Where you feel afraid to get close all over again? Spend a few moments asking Jesus for what it is that you need.